What happens when a Hollywood talk show host decides to ambush one of the most respected action legends of all time with gotcha questions and personal attacks? Well, you're about to find out. And trust me, this is one interview that went completely off the rails in ways nobody saw coming. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment because this story is absolutely wild. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday evening as Chuck Norris walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set. The audience erupted in applause, clearly excited to see the martial arts legend and action star who had become an internet sensation thanks to countless memes about his supposed superhuman abilities. Chuck smiled and waved, his trademark confident demeanor intact as he made his way to the guest chair. "Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Norris," Jimmy announced with his usual grin, though something seemed slightly off about his energy tonight. The audience continued clapping as Chuck settled into his seat, adjusting his jacket with the casual confidence of someone who had done thousands of interviews over his decades-long career. "Chuck, great to have you on the show," Jimmy began, leaning back in his chair. "You know, I have to say, the internet really loves you. All those Chuck Norris facts, the memes, the jokes about how tough you are. How does it feel to be basically a living legend at this point?" Chuck chuckled, his voice carrying that familiar Texas drawl. "Well, Jimmy, I appreciate the kind words. It's been quite a ride, I'll tell you that. When I started out in martial arts competitions back in the day, I never imagined I'd end up as some kind of internet phenomenon. But hey, if it makes people smile, I'm happy to play along." Right. Jimmy nodded, but there was something calculating in his expression. "Speaking of playing along, I've got to ask you about something. There's been some controversy lately about some of your political views, your support for certain candidates. Some people are saying you've become pretty extreme in your old age. What do you say to that?" The audience fell silent. This wasn't the lighthearted celebrity banter they were expecting. Chuck's expression remained neutral. But those who knew him well could see a slight tightening around his eyes. "Jimmy, I'm not sure what you're getting at," Chuck replied calmly. "I've always been open about my beliefs and values. I believe in God, family, and country. I believe in the Constitution and the freedoms it guarantees. If that makes me extreme in some people's eyes, well, that says more about them than it does about me." Jimmy leaned forward, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "But come on, Chuck. You've endorsed some pretty controversial figures. You've made statements that a lot of people find divisive. Don't you think someone with your platform, your influence, has a responsibility to be more, I don't know, moderate? More inclusive? Inclusive of what, exactly?" Chuck's voice remained steady, but there was an edge creeping in. "I've never said anything hateful about any group of people. I've never promoted violence or discrimination. What I have done is stand up for traditional American values and the principles that made this country great. If that offends some people, well, I'm sorry they feel that way, but I won't apologize for my convictions." The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that this was heading somewhere dark. Jimmy's production team behind the cameras were exchanging worried glances. "Traditional values," Jimmy repeated with a slight smirk. "That's interesting phrasing. Because when some people say traditional values, what they really mean is they want to go back to a time when certain groups of people didn't have the same rights they have today. Is that what you mean, Chuck?" Chuck's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. "Jimmy, I think you know me better than that. I've worked with people from all backgrounds throughout my career. I've never judged anyone based on anything other than their character and their actions. What I mean by traditional values is things like personal responsibility, hard work, respect for others, and faith in God. If you have a problem with those values, then I think we have very different ideas about what makes a good society." "But that's just it, isn't it?" Jimmy pressed on, clearly not backing down. "You talk about respect for others, but then you support politicians and policies that a lot of people see as disrespectful to entire communities. How do you reconcile that?" The audience was now completely silent, the uncomfortable tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Chuck took a deep breath, his hands remaining relaxed on the armrests of his chair, but his posture had straightened. "Jimmy, I came on your show tonight as a guest, Not as a defendant in some kind of trial, Chuck said, his voice still calm but with an unmistakable warning tone. I respect your right to your opinions, and I'd appreciate the same courtesy in return. If you want to have a serious discussion about politics or values, that's fine, but let's do it with some mutual respect. Jimmy's smirk widened. Oh, I'm being respectful, Chuck. I'm just asking questions. Isn't that what journalists are supposed to do? Hold public figures accountable for their statements and positions? Or do you think you should be above that kind of scrutiny? Accountable for what exactly? Chuck's voice was getting firmer. For having opinions? For exercising my constitutional right to free speech? For supporting candidates I believe in? Jimmy, you're not holding me accountable. You're trying to shame me for not thinking the way you think I should think. I'm trying to understand how someone who claims to respect all people can support policies that hurt marginalized communities. Jimmy shot back, his pretense of civility starting to slip. I mean, let's be honest here, Chuck. Your political views are pretty out of step with most of Hollywood, most of the entertainment industry. Don't you ever feel like maybe you're on the wrong side of history? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Chuck stared at Jimmy for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority. Jimmy, I've been in this business for over 50 years. I've seen trends come and go. I've seen popular opinions shift like the wind. And I've learned that being on the right side of history isn't about following the crowd or saying what's popular at the moment. It's about standing up for what you believe is right, even when it's not easy, even when it's not popular. Jimmy was clearly frustrated that Chuck wasn't taking the bait, wasn't getting defensive or angry in the way he had obviously hoped. He decided to escalate further. But what about the fact that some of your supporters, some of the people who agree with your political views, have been involved in some pretty ugly incidents? Doesn't that concern you? Doesn't that make you want to maybe reevaluate your positions? That question was the line in the sand. Chuck's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since sitting down, his famous composure showed the first crack. The audience could feel the shift in energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Jimmy, that's a pretty low blow even for you, Chuck said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You're trying to hold me responsible for the actions of people I've never met, never spoken to, and have no control over. That's not journalism. That's character assassination. Jimmy sensed he had finally gotten under Chuck's skin and pressed his advantage. I'm just saying, when you put certain ideas out there, when you support certain movements, you have to take some responsibility for the consequences. That's how leadership works, isn't it? Leadership? Chuck's voice carried a note of disbelief. Jimmy, let me tell you something about leadership. Real leadership means standing up for what's right, not what's popular. It means taking responsibility for your own actions, not scapegoating others for theirs. And it certainly doesn't mean sitting behind a desk and taking cheap shots at guests who came here in good faith. The production crew was getting increasingly nervous. Several producers were making frantic gestures from behind the cameras, trying to signal Jimmy to dial it back, but he was either ignoring them or simply too caught up in the moment to notice. Cheap shots? Jimmy's voice rose slightly. Chuck, I'm asking you legitimate questions about your public statements and political endorsements. If you can't handle that kind of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be making those statements in the first place. Chuck leaned forward in his chair, his presence suddenly seeming to fill the entire studio. Jimmy, I've been handling scrutiny since before you were old enough to shave. I've been asked tough questions by better journalists than you in situations a lot more challenging than this. What I won't handle is being ambushed by someone who invited me here under false pretenses, just so he could score cheap political points with his audience. False pretenses? Jimmy laughed, but it sounded forced and hollow. This is a talk show, Chuck. We talk about current events, we ask questions, we have discussions. That's literally what the show is. No, Jimmy, that's not what this is, Chuck replied, his voice steady as steel. This is you trying to embarrass me because you don't like my politics. This is you thinking you can bully me into backing down from my beliefs because you have home field advantage and a friendly audience. But here's the thing you don't seem to understand. I've faced down tougher opponents than you in real fights, not just verbal sparring matches. The audience was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't the usual celebrity interview gone slightly awkward. This was two men having a genuine confrontation on live television. Jimmy tried to regain control of the situation. Look, Chuck, I'm not trying to bully anyone. I'm just trying to understand how someone with your reputation, your status as a role model, can support positions that a lot of people find harmful. Harmful to whom? Chuck shot back immediately. And by what standard? Jimmy, you keep talking about my positions being harmful or extreme, but you haven't actually specified what positions you're talking about. You're speaking in vague generalities and innuendo. If you want to have this conversation, let's have it honestly. Tell me specifically what I've said or done that you find so objectionable. Jimmy hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting Chuck to call his bluff so directly. Well, I mean, your support for certain political candidates, your statements about traditional marriage, your views on immigration policy. My views on immigration policy? Chuck interrupted. Jimmy, what exactly do you think my views on immigration policy are? Have you actually read anything I've written or said on the subject, or are you just assuming based on some political stereotype? I've read enough, Jimmy replied defensively. No, you haven't, Chuck said flatly. Because if you had, you'd know that I'm the son of immigrants myself. My grandmother came to this country from Ireland with nothing but hope for a better life. I believe in legal immigration. I believe in following proper procedures. And I believe in national sovereignty. Those aren't extreme positions. Those are common-sense positions held by millions of Americans across the political spectrum. Jimmy was clearly getting frustrated that his attack wasn't landing the way he had planned. But what about your comments on social issues? Your opposition to certain progressive policies? My opposition to policies I believe are wrong? Chuck's voice carried a note of incredulity. Jimmy, when did it become controversial to have an opinion? When did it become extreme to disagree with the political establishment? I thought diversity of thought was supposed to be a good thing. It is, but there are limits, Jimmy replied, his mask slipping further. Some positions are just wrong, Chuck. Some views are outdated and harmful. According to who? Chuck demanded. According to you? According to the entertainment industry? According to the political left? Jimmy, that's not how a free society works. You don't get to decide which opinions are acceptable and which ones aren't. That's the kind of thinking that leads to authoritarianism. The word authoritarianism seemed to hit Jimmy like a slap. His face flushed slightly, and his voice took on a sharper edge. That's rich. Coming from someone who supports politicians who want to restrict voting rights and limit civil liberties. That's a lie, and you know it, Chuck said, his voice dangerous now. I have never supported restricting anyone's voting rights or limiting anyone's civil liberties. What I have supported is election integrity and constitutional governance. If you're going to accuse me of something, at least have the decency to be accurate about it. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Audience members were looking around nervously, some were whispering to each other, and the production crew was in full panic mode behind the cameras. Jimmy seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. Chuck, I think what's happening here is that you're not used to being challenged. You're used to friendly interviews where people just ask you about your movies and your martial arts background. But this is the real world, and in the real world, public figures get held accountable for their statements. Chuck stood up slowly from his chair, his full height and presence suddenly dominating the studio. The action was deliberate, controlled, but unmistakably threatening. Jimmy, I've been held accountable my entire life. I've been accountable to my students, to my audiences, to my family, and to my conscience. What I won't be held accountable for is your misrepresentation of my views and your deliberate distortion of my character. Sit down, Chuck, Jimmy said, trying to sound authoritative but coming across as nervous. We're not done here. Chuck looked down at him with something approaching pity. Yes, Jimmy, we are done. I came here as your guest, and you've treated me like your enemy. You've lied about my positions. You've tried to associate me with people and actions I have nothing to do with. And you've shown complete disrespect for both me and your audience. The studio fell into complete silence as Chuck remained standing, towering over Jimmy, who was still seated behind his desk. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. "Chuck, please sit down." Jimmy tried again, his voice betraying his nervousness. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over and talk about your new projects?" Chuck shook his head slowly. "No, Jimmy. You don't get to ambush someone and then pretend it didn't happen when it doesn't go your way. You brought me here under the pretense of a normal interview, then tried to turn it into some kind of political hit job. That's not journalism. That's cowardice." "Cowardice?" Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. "I'm asking tough questions. That's what real journalists do." "Real journalists ask honest questions based on facts," Chuck replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect his entire life. "They don't set traps, they don't misrepresent their guests' positions, and they don't try to score cheap political points at their guests' expense. What you've done here tonight is disgraceful." Jimmy stood up abruptly, trying to match Chuck's presence, but the effect was comical rather than intimidating. "Disgraceful? You know what's disgraceful, Chuck? Using your celebrity status to promote divisive political views that hurt people. That's what's disgraceful." "There you go again," Chuck said, his patience finally exhausted. "Hurt people how, exactly? By encouraging them to take personal responsibility? By promoting traditional values like faith, family, and hard work? By supporting the Constitution and the rule of law? Jimmy, if those things hurt people, then we have very different definitions of what it means to help someone. You know exactly what I'm talking about." Jimmy shot back, his composure completely gone now. "Your endorsements, your statements, they embolden people who want to roll back civil rights, who want to discriminate against minorities, who want to suppress votes. You can't just pretend that doesn't happen." Chuck's expression hardened. "Jimmy, that is a damnable lie, and you know it. I have never, ever promoted discrimination against anyone. I have never supported suppressing anyone's vote. I have never said or done anything that would encourage hatred or violence against any group of people. The fact that you would accuse me of such things shows just how low you're willing to sink." The audience was now audibly gasping and murmuring. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable television. This was a genuine public confrontation between two public figures with fundamentally different worldviews. Jimmy's face was red now, his voice rising. "Then explain to me how you can support politicians who do exactly those things. Explain to me how you can align yourself with movements that have documented histories of discrimination and voter suppression." "I don't have to explain anything to you," Chuck said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're not a prosecutor. I'm not a defendant. And this isn't a courtroom. But since you insist on making accusations, let me make something crystal clear. I support politicians who I believe will defend the Constitution, protect American sovereignty, and promote policies that strengthen families and communities. If you disagree with those goals, that's your right. But don't you dare question my character or my motivations." "Your motivations?" Jimmy laughed bitterly. "Chuck, your motivations are obvious to anyone paying attention. You're an old man who's afraid of change, afraid of progress, afraid of a world that's moving beyond your outdated worldview." The insult hung in the air like a physical blow. The audience collectively held its breath, sensing that Jimmy had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Chuck's voice, when he spoke, was so quiet that the studio microphones had to strain to pick it up. "Jimmy, I've been called a lot of things in my life. I've been insulted by better men than you in situations where the stakes were a lot higher than a television interview. But what you just said tells me everything I need to know about your character and your integrity." "Oh, spare me the righteous indignation," Jimmy snapped. "You dish it out, but you can't take it when someone calls you on your nonsense." "I can take criticism just fine," Chuck replied. "What I won't take is being lied about by someone who doesn't have the courage to engage with my actual positions. You've spent this entire interview attacking strawmen and making false accusations. You haven't asked me a single honest question about what I actually believe or why I believe it." Jimmy was fully unhinged now, his voice shrill. "I know exactly what you believe, Chuck. You believe in a version of America that never really existed, where everyone looked like you and thought like you and acted like you. Well, guess what? That America is dead, And people like you killed it with your bigotry and your close-mindedness. The studio erupted. Audience members were shouting, some in support of Chuck, others defending Jimmy. The production crew was frantically trying to restore order, but the situation had spiraled completely out of control. Chuck looked around the chaos, then back at Jimmy with something approaching disgust. Jimmy, you know what's really sad about this? You had an opportunity tonight to have a real conversation with someone who disagrees with you. You could have learned something, your audience could have learned something, and maybe we could have found some common ground. Instead, you chose to grandstand and attack. You chose division over dialogue. Don't lecture me about dialogue, Jimmy shot back. You're the one who's been promoting division for years with your political endorsements and your backward views. Chuck walked around the desk, moving closer to Jimmy, who instinctively took a step back. Jimmy, I'm going to give you one last chance to be a man about this. Apologize for the lies you've told about me tonight. Apologize to your audience for wasting their time with this political theater, and maybe we can end this with some dignity and tact. I'm not apologizing for anything, Jimmy said, trying to sound defiant but coming across as petulant. Everything I've said tonight is true, and you know it. Chuck nodded slowly, as if Jimmy's response confirmed something he had already suspected. Then we're done here. He turned toward the audience, his voice carrying clearly throughout the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got a political ambush. That's not your fault, and it's not mine. He turned back to Jimmy, who was standing frozen behind his desk. Jimmy, you invited me here as your guest, and then you treated me like your enemy. You lied about my positions, you questioned my character, and you showed complete disrespect for the principles that make civil discourse possible. I've met enemy combatants who showed more honor than you've shown tonight. The production team was now openly trying to cut to commercial, but Chuck's presence was so commanding that even the camera operators seemed reluctant to look away. Security is going to escort you out now, Jimmy said, trying to regain some authority, but his voice was shaking. Chuck laughed, a sound that carried no humor whatsoever. Jimmy, I'm walking out of here on my own. And let me tell you something, I've been thrown out of better places by tougher men than you'll ever be. The difference is, they had good reasons. He began walking toward the exit, then stopped and turned back one final time. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy? You had Chuck Norris on your show, and instead of celebrating what makes America great, you chose to tear it down. Instead of building bridges, you chose to burn them. That says everything anyone needs to know about who you really are. And with that, Chuck Norris walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live set, leaving behind a stunned audience, a humiliated host, and one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history. The camera finally cut to commercial, as Jimmy stood alone behind his desk, the sound of Chuck's footsteps echoing through the silent studio. The interview that was supposed to be a routine celebrity appearance had become something else entirely, a moment that would define both men's legacies in ways neither had anticipated. So there you have it. The night Chuck Norris dominated Jimmy Kimmel so completely that they had to escort the host's ego off the set. Make sure to subscribe if you want more stories like this, and drop a comment below. What do you think would have happened if Chuck had actually lost his temper completely instead of maintaining that legendary self-control?